Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Gerald, and I'm Associate Professor of Public Health Policy and Management here at the University of Arizona. And it's my pleasure to be talking to you today about health policy and the political process. I'll try to make sure that I'm speaking slowly and enunciating clearly to enhance your experience. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So you should be seeing my screen, hopefully here, my PowerPoint presentation that I prepared for you today on health policy and the political process. When we think about health policy, particularly in an academic perspective, we're really talking about something like the policy brief. This is something that I would put together as an academician to help policymakers think through a particular problem. And so what the policy brief does is it identifies a specific problem and tries to do so in such a way to capture its most salient elements and clearly describe the problem, then create an exhaustive list of solutions where the advantages and disadvantages of each are described, and there is some hierarchy with the preferred solutions being given a major portion of the brief or presented first, and then with other recommendations following that. And one of the key elements of the policy brief is that it's evidence-based, that as an academician, I go to the literature, I look to see what data are available on this particular problem, looking at the strength and breadth of the evidence that is available to us to help us make decisions, and so that it's not just opinion. There certainly may be elements of opinion. I will use my knowledge and experience to create analysis, but ultimately the underlying key elements of the policy brief stand on the data that others have discovered on this particular problem. And the idea is that policymakers who are often laypersons, particularly on issues that involve scientific inquiry, and they value external input from respective sources. They don't have the time, the energy, the skills to exhaustively research these particular problems, given the multitude of problems that they face. And so this is where academicians can step in and help augment the power of our elected officials to understand and respond to a particular set of problems. That's at least the ideal, but it's important to recognize that policymakers consider other factors above and beyond the evidence or the data when they make their decisions. And we're going to talk about some of those other elements as we move through this lecture, but it's important to know that while evidence is important, data are important, these are not the only factors that will be used to create a decision. And so oftentimes we can see that. We will see a decision made by legislation, and critics will say, this legislation doesn't align with the data that's available. And it's important to understand why that happens sometimes. In a cynical perspective, I oftentimes say, we write up a policy brief, we send it to our elected officials, and sometimes when we see the legislation that appears afterwards, it's as if they never read our recommendations after all. It's not quite that pessimistic, but oftentimes it feels that way. All right. And so certainly institutions like universities and other higher learning institutions can produce policy briefs. So it's something my colleagues and I do quite frequently, but there are other sources of policy briefs within the community. There are many foundations that are put together. They have a not-for-profit mission. They hire full-time experts to work on a range of problems that's relevant to that particular organization. And these entities will produce often very high quality data synthesis that help guide policy implementation. And so it's kind of important to think a little bit about the distinction between analysis and research. And so from my perspective, research is usually something that's carried on at universities. There are research efforts underway by not-for-profits, but here in the United States, a bulk of the basic science research is done by academic institutions using very rigorous and systematic processes to discover new knowledge, right? To be the first ever to describe some particular relationship, some cause and effect situation. And so in that regard, that's research versus analysis. Is using evidence that others have created, combining it in a way that is novel, that's insightful, that can guide future action. And so the realm of analysis is much broader and wider reaching than the realm of research, and is often what policymakers are consuming. So policymakers don't usually go to the literature and investigate a randomized controlled trial, for example. Rather, they're using analysis that's put together by academic institutions or these not-for-profit organizations, and they're reading a summary of the research, and that's analysis. Another key distinction that's useful to have in mind is the difference between partisan sources and nonpartisan sources. And so a partisan source is a source that has a clear conflict of interest, that institution or organization is producing materials that's intended to steer policymakers in a specific direction that will lead to their own self-interest and not necessarily the greater or common good. Whereas other organizations, many not-for-profit organizations, and hopefully many academic institutions are nonpartisan in nature, meaning that there's no underlying agenda other than trying to speak for as broad of community as possible and speaking about the welfare of everyone versus my own particular self-interest when I'm writing, right? And so it's important to think about the organizations in which you are obtaining your data in your analysis from, and to be sure that there's no hidden agenda or conflict of interest that might lead to a biased reporting of the data, and you only are seeing part of the facts and not all of the facts, or those facts have been put together in such a way that it doesn't lead you to the truth. And so that is not always self-evident when you just look at a website. And so if you're putting together something from a professional perspective, it's incumbent upon you to dig deeper and understand what that organization's self-interest might be and how it might bias that organization's work. Okay. And again, as the point I made on the last slide, this is important and this is my bread and butter. I believe in it very strongly, but there are other factors that politicians and elected officials are going to take into consideration when making a decision. It won't just be the data and what is best for everyone, unfortunately. Sometimes these legislative outcomes have a particular slant to them, which may benefit some at the expense of others. Okay. And so here in the United States, public support for regulation. And so regulation is basically the government. In our case, we have a federal level of government, we have state level of government, and then we have local government. At any of these levels, governments can tell businesses and individuals what to do. What are the laws that they have to, or rules that they have to follow when interacting with others, when producing goods, when dealing with pollution, those type of things. And regulation in many cases is thought to be for the public good. But when you ask the public, ask general citizens about their attitudes regarding regulation, more people than not will say there's too much government involvement in our day-to-day activities, whether we're running a business or conducting our own lives. And a minority, only 20%, think that there's too little regulation, right? But what we know for sure when we examine our own day-to-day lives is there is a lot of regulation out there. And if there's so much public animosity towards regulation, why on earth do our elected officials, who in theory should be beholden to us, produce so much regulation? And so that's one of the other kind of features that we're going to try to pull together here as we move into the middle part of the lecture. Here in the United States, another point to pull out is the general public's attitudes about regulation is heavily influenced by their partisanship, meaning which political party they report being affiliated with. So here in the United States, we have two major political parties: the Republican Party, which is considered right of center, conservatives, and then we have the Democratic Party, which is left of center and is considered to be a liberal or progressive size. And so individuals who report to us that they are Republicans or lean Republican, you ask them about regulation, and the vast majority will report there's too much regulation. Whereas individuals who self-identify as being affiliated with the Democratic Party report much, much less antipathy or animosity towards regulation, right? And so our two political parties approach and think about regulation very differently, with generally, on average, Republicans being much more hostile to additional regulations, and Democrats being more open to or favorable towards additional regulation, right? And so that is going to be something that is taken into account in our political processes. Okay, and so getting back to this question of, if the general public on average dislikes regulation, why is there so much regulation? One perspective is the public interest view of regulation. And from this perspective, regulation or legislation seeks to solve problems faced by communities. It may correct market failures and curbs abuses of power amongst business entities, for example, a monopoly, or it may redistribute resources to those in need or in crisis. And so thinking about anti-poverty programs or thinking about responses to natural disasters, regulation and legislation can help address each of these particular features. In the United States, one really key success story with regard to regulation is environmental pollution, specifically air pollution. And so back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the United States relied very heavily on coal-generated electricity. And in the production of electricity using coal, a lot of pollution was created and was emitted by these power plants. The pollution included things like heavy metals, like arsenic, but also sulfur dioxide, which when combined with oxygen made a very acidic brew when it came time for rain. And so what you see in this upper right panel here in the United States, where areas in red represent areas where there was a large deposition of essentially sulfuric acid in our forest and wetlands. And acidity is very important for the health of forest, and turning a forest soil from alkaline to acidic damages the trees and led to large tree die-offs in the eastern United States. And this was very disruptive to the general public, to industries that relied on having forestry and trees and open spaces, think tourism, logging, those type of activities. Well, the government stepped in and regulated power generation plants and said, here are the limits that exist with regard to your ability to extrude sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. And you've got to bring those levels down. And the goal is to restore the health of our forest and wetlands. And what you can see in the bottom right panel is the amount of sulfur dioxide deposition in the United States from 2017 to 2019, right? Our modern times. And the map is almost entirely green, which indicates in this particular instance, regulation was very helpful in solving a problem faced by a community, which was power generation in certain places were depositing deadly pollution in others. And so the federal government stepped in to regulate the amount of pollution. And over a period of 30 years, we've seen dramatic reductions in power generated pollution in our eastern forest, and we've had a return of the health of our forest. And so a definite success story, but there are many, many other examples that don't align so well with public interest view. There are instances in which the regulation appears to benefit a small number of individuals or entities and produces harm for many, many others. And the question is, well, where does the public interest view of government fall short? What does it not explain? Well, to fill in this particular gap of when public interest doesn't explain the legislation or regulation that's produced is something called regulatory capture. And this theory basically says regulation oftentimes serves the firm's interest, not the public's. And so by the firm, we mean the industry that's being regulated itself is benefiting from the regulation, and the harms that are being produced are to the general public. And this is the exact opposite expected outcome from the public interest view of government, right? Okay. And the idea here is that firms, businesses seek regulation to gain advantage in competitive markets. And by doing so, they increase profits within that industry. You may have higher than average salaries in those industries. And so when researchers looked at industries and the level of regulation in those industries that were heavily regulated seem to have higher profits and higher salaries than those industries that were not regulated. And this seemed to run a bit counter to what public interest theory might suggest for us. And this is where regulatory capture came in. And it said that government agencies, like in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency, have a predictable life cycle. And so during the youth of the agency, so when the agency is just created, an agency is created because there's some pressing problem that the federal government has been called upon to address. And during that early period with this very specific mandate and focus, the activities of that government agency align very well with public interest view of government. But over time, that agency becomes captured by the industries that it's regulating. And the regulations then tend to move away from protecting the common good and to protecting the industry itself. And in the United States, one of the issues that we have, one is lobbying, right? So these industries will send individuals to Washington, D.C., our capital, to lobby our lawmakers for specific legislation to help those industries obtain higher profits. And in doing so, they may make donations to that elected official's campaign so that they can win re-election. Or you might see an elected official who loses an election will exit government and then be hired by some of these industries, and the elected person will use their contacts and their influence outside of government to influence the policymaking process. And so over time, as the government agency matures, it becomes captured by the special interests, and it develops a very cozy the industry itself develops a very cozy relationship with the regulatory agency and the elected officials who oversee that particular agency, thus allowing the regulations to benefit the industry and not the general public. And so the question would be, well, why does this happen? Because our elected officials, in theory, should be responsive to the general voter, right? If I, as a voter, recognize that my elected officials aren't writing laws that are in my benefit, but are rather giving gains to these special interests, how can I then just vote them out, right? I can go, well, I'm going to vote for a new official so that I can get laws and regulations that benefit me. So I'm just going to throw the bums out. Why do our public servants allow our regulatory agencies to be captured? Well, for this, we need a new theory or a new way to look at this. And this is interest group theory, or another way you might hear it is economic theory of government. And it basically says that legislation, right, when the government writes a new law, that law oftentimes creates wealth that can't be obtained in competitive markets. And so this legislation or regulation will serve the interest of the business community, or at least it will serve the interest of powerful groups who have concentrated interest to obtain wealth through the exercise of political power. And they extract that wealth by imposing small costs diffusely on poorly organized groups and individuals. And so that would be me as a regular citizen. Because legislation can create wealth for these concentrated interest groups, it creates a market, an economic market, if you will, for legislation where there are buyers and sellers of legislation, and there's a currency for transaction. And so the buyers of political legislation are those groups that have concentrated interest in the outcomes of those pieces of legislation. The most obvious group with concentrated interest is industry. So think about mining industry, health insurance companies here in the United States. You could have things like universities and hospitals, pharmaceutical manufacturers. These groups within an industry have concentrated interest in seeing legislation written in such a way that it may lower their cost of operations, may allow them to charge higher prices. But the regulation somehow can enhance their economic position, and so they're willing to pay for it. They're willing to buy legislation that suits their own interest. It's also theoretically possible, and in some cases reality, that citizen groups can naturally form with concentrated interest. So here in the United States, groups with particular power that aren't directly connected to an industry might include the American Association of Retired People, looking after the needs of America's elderly, the National Rifle Association, who looks after the needs of gun owners and those who support gun ownership and gun rights, Greenpeace, those who seek to improve environmental conditions, the health and well-being of nature. These groups can also form to seek regulation that's going to achieve their ends. These ends aren't always financial. For example, Greenpeace might want to see protections in place for water pollution in our country's rivers and streams to protect the health of fish and other aquatic species like amphibians and birds and those that feed them in the food chain. Right? So that's who buyers are. Who are sellers? Well, sellers are elected officials who need support to win re-election, right? They're the people who write the laws. They're the people who make the regulations. And this can include elected officials in the executive branch, like the presidency here in the United States, or governors of our particular states. It could be the legislators, senators, representatives that we send to Washington, D.C. to act on our behalf. And in some cases in the United States, some judges are actually elected at state levels. And so any of our three branches of government in the United States can theoretically create political markets for legislation or rulings. And these sellers, the reason they're selling legislation is they're hoping to gain currency that can help them with their most important task, which is getting reelected. And so if I go to all the trouble and effort to be elected to Congress to a 2-year term, well, I want to stay there. I want to have a job, but I also want to accomplish the goals that I went to Washington in the first place. And to achieve those goals, I need seniority. I need to move up the ranks. And to do that, I have to get reelected. And so our elected officials in our House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. Our senators are elected every 6, our president every 4. And so it creates this constant cycle where reelection is almost always on the minds of our elected officials, and they're looking to sell legislation to gain votes in some cases, campaign donations, or volunteers. Any of those three things can help them win reelection in their next race. Donation of money to campaigns is probably the most important of the three, because you can convert money into almost anything. It's something that's called fungible. You can take money and potentially use it to secure votes. You can take money to buy staff instead of relying on volunteers. You can use money to create marketing and advertisements to persuade voters to reelect you. And so in our political system here in the United States, where campaign donations are not very well regulated or restricted, they're an incredibly important source of reelection power for our incumbents or people who are already elected. And so in the case of these political markets, these industry groups and citizen groups bring to our elected officials votes, donations, or volunteers in some form to help them get reelected. And in exchange, they obtain legislation that's favorable to them, their industry, or their other goals. All right. And so for this to make sense for an industry is not going to mobilize itself to tackle every problem that our country faces, but rather when an industry seeks to influence or lobby government to obtain legislation, the benefits of organizing and expending those donations, expending that time and energy must exceed their organizational costs, right? If they have to spend more money to organize themselves to obtain this legislation, then the legislation itself will bring to them, it doesn't make sense and they won't lobby. And so when industry in particular lobbies, they lobby on very narrow pieces of legislation and ignore 90% of what's going on in Washington, D.C. And so an industry might look out for regulations that might lower its profits, might raise its costs because it has to meet more environmental restrictions, or it might make it easier for competitors to enter the market and compete with them. And so industry is going to be on the lookout for regulation that will harm them. More broadly speaking, they might oppose things like tax increases to fund other programs. And so when it makes sense for these groups with concentrated interest to organize, they will do so. And one of the things to recognize in our United States, we have a market economy. And in the competitive markets, there are no excess profits. And so when an industry is competitive, the return to capital is around 3 to 5% per year. And if you look at our industry average profits in the United States across all industries, it's in the range of about 4 to 5%, right? But some industries, for example, in healthcare, the pharmaceutical industry, average industry profits in the pharmaceutical industry are 17% or 3 times what is typical. And so you can bet your bottom dollar that the pharmaceutical industry has a very active lobbying presence in Washington, D.C. And that's their trade group called PhRMA. And they will spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying our elected officials for favorable rules and regulations about drug discovery, drug development, drug patents, so that they can continue to obtain profits that are far in excess of what could be found if their industry were truly competitive. And so these regulations may impede a competitor from entering the market. They may somehow lower their production cost by changing the way they interact with labor or the way that they're taxed. Or they may be able to find ways to raise cost to consumers by raising their prices. And so regulation can work through multiple mechanisms. You know, again, citizen groups can also come together to organize by age, for example, American Association of Retired People, income, or issues like gun rights. And so in some regards, they have similarities to what industry or businesses might do, but instead of seeking financial gains, oftentimes these other organizations are more issue oriented and they're seeking their preferences to be met and not necessarily a financial gain, right? So there are exceptions to industry dominated lobbying. Okay, so again, now we get back to the conflict between public interest view of government and this economic theory of government. And the key point is legislation can be both or can be one or the other. And so it's not always that our elected officials are corrupt and captured by these interest groups. Sometimes elected officials actually do produce legislation that seeks the common good. But there are a lot of instances where they don't, where that legislation benefits the few and the burdens are borne by the many, right? And so in essence, elected officials are balancing this need for campaign donations, volunteers, and so forth against just public opinion and votes. Because if our elected officials run too far counter to what the general public is, even if the interest groups are behind them, they may not gain re-election. And so there's always a political calculus when elected officials are thinking about passing legislation. And it's important for you to know this as someone who might be interested in health policy and advocating on groups that you are serving or advocating on behalf of your own profession. You have to recognize that when you go to lobby and convince your elected officials to do something good, you have to view and frame your ask or your needed policy change through the lens of it has to enhance somehow your elected officials' opportunity to be reelected. If you bring them a big stinky thing that's going to go over like a lead balloon and harm their reelection chances, they're probably not going to be very supportive. And so it's imperative that you think through not only what's the right thing to do from an evidence-based perspective, but how do you frame that in such a way that it enhances instead of detracts from your elected officials' reelection chances? Because that's going to be one of their key deciding points. Okay. Why can't voters, at least here in the United States, do a better job of overseeing the outcomes of our elected officials, right? If voters were knowledgeable and up to date on what our elected officials were doing and saw that the legislation that was being produced is not in their best interest, we could just vote against them and select a new person to take their position, right? Why doesn't that happen more frequently? Why do incumbents have such a large advantage? And so in the United States, incumbents win more than 80% of all races. It's very difficult for a newcomer to compete head to head with an incumbent and take that elected seat away from them. Well, there are a number of problems that lie on the voters' side. So not all eligible voters vote, particularly here in the United States. Voter participation in election years may be in the mid 60%, with 2 out of 3 people voting and 1 out of 3 not voting. In off years, when presidents aren't being elected, participation can fall below 50%. Amongst some demographics, the very young, the poor, or minority or other disenfranchised groups, voter participation can fall below 25%. And if voters are not voting, then elected officials have much more latitude and leeway about what legislation they produce and support, because they're no longer beholden to voters. And so imposing a cost, for example, thinking about climate change, the impact of climate change is going to hurt the young the most, right? The young have a lot to gain by imposing additional regulations on industry to reduce pollution, the release of greenhouse gases. But if only a quarter of young people vote, elected officials have very little incentive to seek regulation that benefits young people. It's just not in their reelection favor to do so. Instead, they may be much more willing, and they are much more willing, to produce legislation that benefits polluters, energy companies, oil companies, because they provide donations that will enhance their reelection chances. And so there's no harm to writing legislation favorable to the industry when the people most affected by it don't turn out and vote against that particular regulation. So that's one problem. Not eligible voters vote. And the ones who do vote aren't always very informed because it's costly to be informed. I have a job, and that job doesn't include monitoring my elected official for all the things that they do and their job, right? I'm worried about my job. I'm worried about my family. I'm worried about putting food on my table, advancing my own career. I only have a limited amount of time to devote to understanding what my elected official is doing. So I may take some shortcuts, like I might vote by party affiliation. Here in the United States, I might go, well, the Republican Party seems to capture most of the interest that I have. And so if I vote Republican, sometimes they might do something I don't like, but most of the times they're going to vote how I might vote myself personally. Alternatively, I might choose to vote Democrat, right? Because I see that particular party aligning with my own personal values more closely. And so when I go to vote, I don't know who I'm voting for. I just vote by party, and I vote a straight ticket or choose all Republicans or all Democrats. Well, that's not very good at holding or accounted or elected officials accountable. Or I may say, okay, well, I'm going to make some individual decisions and I rely on campaign advertising. And so I look at street signs, I look at radio ads, I look at TV ads or YouTube ads, and I make my decision based on what I see there. But those ads are often very misleading and untruthful. And from that perspective, then I may not be doing myself any favors by relying on campaign advertising, because those campaign advertising may not truly reflect the positions that the elected officials hold on the issues that are important to me. The easiest thing maybe I can do is I'm going to be a single dimension voter. So here in the United States, it may be abortion rights, it may be gun control, and I'm going to go, I don't know anything about my elected official, but I know what their stance is on gun control. And I'm going to vote for the official that has the closest alignment with me on my most important issue. And I'm going to give up everything else as long as I can get this one thing that I really, really care about, right? So we got two major problems. A lot of voters don't vote, and the voters that do are often terribly misinformed about the important issues. And in these circumstances, elected officials then have a lot more latitude to craft legislation that doesn't match voter preferences. Okay. So legislators, because of straight ticket voters, can act independent of party. And so if there's a circumstance, and let's say I'm a Republican and I need to vote on something to get a donation or whatever, if I vote against my party's interests, sometimes it can work out okay for me. I can't always vote against my party's interest, but if I do it judiciously, I can do so without repercussions. Sometimes I can make decisions earlier in my elected tenure that are different from decisions I'll make when it's closer to reelection, right? Because if I'm a senator in the United States, what happens during the first 3 or 4 years of my elected office don't matter. Voters can't remember that far back. But the year or two prior to my reelection, you're darn tootin' that I'm going to be very cautious about how my votes go down, because I know voters are going to be very attuned to votes that I take during the election cycle. And so the fact that elected officials only face election periodically means they can vote in different ways depending on where they are in their election cycle. And then the last kind of thing, which is just more broadly speaking, legislators have skewed type preferences. What legislators want to do is give voters benefits today and push any cost into the future. So for example, climate change. The cost to fix or reduce the impact of climate change is very costly today. We've got to spend a lot of money today to make a difference. And the benefits won't come out for 20, 30, or 40 years. That's a terrible calculus for elected officials. It runs counter to everything they know. What they want to do is give you tax cuts today, even if it means pushing into the future higher greenhouse gases. They may be dead in the future. They may be kicked out of office in the future. And so for their reelection next year, They need to give benefits as much as possible today and push any downsides of their legislation into the distant future where voters won't hold them accountable. All right. So in the United States, let's talk about some nitty-gritty on how legislation is passed. We have a bicameral system here in the United States where we have a Senate and a House of elected officials whose job it is to write legislation. We have an executive branch of government, which is represented by our president and governors, who don't write legislation, but have the authority to sign legislation into law or to veto legislation and exclude it from law, right? And so the executive branch, an important decider, but the individuals who actually write legislation are in our legislative branch. They're senators or they're representatives. We also have a judicial branch of government, and they can invalidate legislation after it's passed. And so it's important to think about them. But in today's lecture, we're going to be focusing mostly on the legislative branch, the group that's responsible for writing the laws. And so the way that it works, whether you're a House member or you're a senator, any individual senator can write a piece of legislation and have it introduced. Okay. Once it's introduced, then depending on what that legislation is designed to do, it's going to get assigned to committee. And this is where everything happens in the United States. It's in committee. All the important decisions are made in a committee. We're going to talk about committees in just a little bit, but individual senators and individual legislators don't have that much power. The power in our government in the legislative process is in the committees of the Senate and the committees of the House of Representatives. Within a committee chair who is from the majority party can kill or move a bill forward on their own whim, right? And so whoever has seniority on that committee in the majority party can kill any legislation on their own without any votes, anything else being done. They have singular power to do that. For a piece of legislation to get out of committee and be considered by the broader or the full House or full Senate, it has to be passed out of committee with majority vote. And so in our political process, we have a two-party winner-take-all system such that the minority party and the legislators of the minority party can't do anything without the acquiescence of our majority parties. And so in essence, the minority party in the United States doesn't have very much to do except try to thwart the activities of the majority because the minority cannot produce any legislation on its own. Okay. And so if a bill actually is taken up by committee, it's voted on by committee, and it passes, well, that process has to start all over again in our other chamber. And so if a bill was introduced in the House, it's passed in the House, well, then it's transferred to the Senate where the process starts all over again, with the key factor being which committee that bill gets assigned to and what happens within that committee. If the bill passes both the House and the Senate, but there are differences between those bills, then there has to be a reconciliation process to align those things. If they actually pass the exact same bill, then in theory, it goes to the president, who can then sign it into law or veto it. And so that's the basics of how legislation is passed in the United States. And I want to focus a little bit more on congressional committees because they're so important. And so the way committees are formed in the Senate and the House is individual members can only serve on a limited number of committees. I serve as an advisor to Senator Mark Kelly here in Arizona. And Senator Kelly, for example, is on the Defense Oversight Committee in the Senate. He has two other committee assignments right now, which I'm blanking on, but that's it. And so there are approximately 20 to 25 committees in the Senate, but Senator Kelly can only serve on 3 of them. And so not every senator can serve on every committee. What that allows to happen is interest groups don't have to lobby all 100 of our senators, for example. Instead, if I'm an energy company, I only need to consider those senators who are on the committee that oversees my industry. I can safely ignore or mostly ignore all the other senators. But those senators that sit on that committee that oversees my industry, I'm going to have a close relationship with those senators. I'm going to think very carefully about my campaign donations. I'm going to have a lobbyist that pays attention to what that senator is doing and how they're voting within committee, because committees have monopoly power over their area. The only place a bill can be introduced to oversee, for example, the energy industry is the Energy Committee. And so there's no other committee that can step on another committee's toes. And for as long as an elected official wants to be reappointed to that committee, then they're reappointed to that committee. And as they have longer and longer longevity, their ultimate goal is to be a chair of a committee. Why? Because the chair is the big decider. A chair decides which pieces of legislation get voted on in committee and which legislation just dies in committee. And so having seniority, being reelected over and over again, leads to more and more power on the part of that senator or House member. Okay. And so again, we talked about we have a two-party winner take all. And so being in the majority party is incredibly important because minority views are not heard and compromises are not necessary oftentimes in our two-party winner-take-all system. And so it ends up in the United States, we can swing right, we can swing back left, because if there is an election that changes the majority party, then the other party doesn't have to compromise with the outgoing losers. They can act on their own without repercussions. Okay, I talk a lot about health policy and medicine. And so just because an interest group forms doesn't mean they can act with impunity. Oftentimes the interest of one group will step on the interest of another group. And an interesting or neat way to think about this in medicine in the United States is the difference between how primary care doctors donate to political campaigns and how specialty doctors donate to political campaigns. And so what we're seeing on the graphic to the left is the average earnings within a medical specialty in the United States. And then the vertical axis represents the probability that a member of that specialty will donate to a Republican official. And on the far right, we have mostly our specialty medical providers, cardiologists, surgeons, gastroenterologists who make very high incomes. Our high income earning specialties are much more likely to vote for Republican candidates, where our primary care doctors and lower paid specialists are much more likely to donate to the Democratic Party, right? And so if Republicans happen to be in power and they listen to a lobbyist from a specialty group, well, there's a good chance that that specialty group might win. But if that win comes at the cost of what might happen in a primary care group, well, primary care doctors can lobby as well. They can go to that Republican congressman and say, hey, this is going to be a problem. We're not going to be able to vote for you, or, we're going to basically support the opposing candidate in the next election. And so depending on how the interests line up across various industries, there's oftentimes industries with concentrated interests lose, and they don't get the legislation that they want because the cost would have been borne by other groups with concentrated interest who basically lobbied in the opposite way. And so having more groups with an interest in a piece of legislation makes it more costly for a group to win, because they have to basically put too much money on the table to get the win, so it's no longer worth it to organize themselves in that manner. Okay, all right. And so kind of the last piece I want to leave you with here is very American-centric, but it's understanding basically how legislation gets passed and who benefits most from legislation in the United States. And so there are 4 theories. 2 of them have to do with individual voters, and that's on the left side. And so one theory is majoritarian electoral democracy. And this theory basically says that average voters make a difference in elections. And what elected officials want to do is pursue a policy agenda that's very close to the median voter. They don't want to get too far to one extreme or the other, because if they do, they make more people unhappy than they make happy. And so they're looking for this sweet Goldilocks spot somewhere around the median voter. And most of their votes are going to fall in line with public opinion. That's what majoritarian electoral democracy will say. Another individual-oriented theory is economic elite domination. And so this theory basically says not all voters have equal power. Voters who are more affluent, they have more money, they're of a higher socioeconomic status, will have more influence than just an average ordinary citizen. And it's still individuals who matter. And so elected officials are still responsive to individuals, but they're not responsive to all individuals equally. They're more responsive to the rich than the poor. Okay. And then we have two theories that basically say voters don't matter. What really matters is interest groups. And the first theory is majoritarian pluralism, which is analogous to majoritarian electoral democracy, but it basically says all interest groups are equal. And there's an infinite number of interest groups that could potentially form. And elected officials are going to be responsive to the median interest group. They're going to look to see how the interest groups align, and they're going to try to stay somewhere in the middle. Conversely, there's biased pluralism, which is analogous to economic elite domination, which basically says, no, not all interest groups are equal. Those interest groups that are formed by business interests, by industry, are much more influential than interest groups that are arising generically from average citizens, like our National Rifle Association, for example. Well, we had a researcher here pull together a really, really large historical data set on legislative outcomes at our federal level and voter opinion, interest group alignment. And he was able, over several thousand legislative outcomes, to test these four theories head to head and make a decision on which theory seemed to best explain legislative outcomes here in the United States. And the winner looked like economic elite domination, so that voters matter to politicians here in the United States, but it's not all voters. It's rich, upper income, upper socioeconomic status voters. And they're the ones who benefit most frequently, not always, but most frequently from legislation. Pluralism also had evidence of success, and this pluralism is interest groups lobbying government. But within that pluralism, biased pluralism, or interest groups who are affiliated with industry and business, seem to be much more influential than interest groups that were connected with mass citizen groups like Greenpeace, American Association of Retired People, that type of thing. And so the two biggest winners, one here, economic elite, the coefficient here being 0.78, statistically significant at the p equals 0.001 level, but also business interest groups at 0.43. So number one and number two, mass-based interest groups, that was also statistically significant. So that it wasn't like they didn't matter. They just didn't matter as much as business groups. And this was mostly because there are many more business groups in the United States than there are citizen groups that lobby. The saddest part here, which will be reflected on the next slide, is that the preferences of the average citizen doesn't seem to matter at all when it comes to elected officials creating legislation that benefits them. Why is this the case? Well, what this author laid out in his work is basically, look, the economic elite, those who have high incomes, are much more likely to vote, right? Rich people vote, poor people don't. So elected officials need votes to win. The affluent are much more likely to volunteer and work in a political campaign. Volunteers are important to re-election. More importantly, perhaps, political donations are much larger among the affluent than they are amongst the poor. And so the elite bring to the table the three things that elected officials need for re-election: votes, campaign donations, and volunteers. It's the trifecta. And that is an important underlying reason why in our system of government, the legislation that's passed seems to really match the preferences of our economic elite more so than any other particular group. But these theories interact in ways that are reinforcing both for success, but also reinforcing for failure. And so what we're looking at on this graphic on the left is interest groups. And so when interest groups oppose something, they're down here at the -2 standard deviations. When more interest groups align with the legislation, it's up here in this favorable reason. And so what we would expect to see, because interest groups influence legislative outcomes, when interest groups oppose legislation, there's a lower likelihood that legislation will be passed. And so the likelihood of a legislation passing is from almost 0 to 80%, right? And so as we go from almost all interest groups are aligned against the legislation to all interest groups favor the legislation, there's this stair step of graded probability that the legislation will pass. The same thing is true about individuals' income. And so when the attitudes of the most affluent in the United States oppose legislation, it's unlikely for legislation to pass, but as the attitudes of our economic elite become more favorable, then the likelihood of that legislation passing grows. But if you put the two things together, the rich, the economic elite, want to see the bill or legislation passed, and interest groups want to see the legislation passed, is where we get this big bar, right? So when interest groups and the rich align in their preferences for legislation, it has almost a 75% chance of passing. When the rich and interest groups uniformly oppose the legislation, it has less than a 15% chance of passing, right? And so there's a lot of difference here in between, but this graphic very vividly shows the impact that our economic elites and interest groups can have in the United States. Okay, and then here is the very distressing thing about public opinion, right? And so this is just general public opinion polling, with the general public almost all favoring legislation and the general public almost always opposing legislation. And this vertical axis represents how likely it is for the legislation to pass. And so there's the same, when all the general public basically hate the legislation, or whether all the general public love the legislation, the probability of passage remains the same. And so there's almost zero influence of public opinion on our legislative outcomes. If the general public views happen to align with the legislative outcome, it's coincidence and correlation, not causation in the United States. All right. And so what I've talked about so far applies to Democrats, it applies to Republican. All of our political parties are susceptible to this influence. And so there's almost no way voters can get around the influence of money in our political system, whether that money is coming from individual economic elites or business groups. There are some exceptions to this case. And so when there's a presidential election cycle, legislation that comes out in that year is a lot more favorable to typical voters than it would normally be, right? It's still more aligned with elite voters, but there's more likelihood that average voters are going to get something that they like during presidential election years. And also when there's been a changeover in our elected officials, right? So when we've thrown the old bums out and we get the new bums in, then the likelihood of seeing something that average voters can stomach goes up. Okay, yeah. So these are key times or windows when average citizens are more likely to do well: presidential elections, regime changes, or when the majority is very narrow in our Senate or House. Okay. And so one of the things that we had in health policy that was really important to us was something we call the Affordable Care Act, and it used government dollars to expand access to care to poor people in the United States. And so we either paid people to get private health insurance, or we gave people our public government health insurance program. And a lot of people criticized the Democrats at the time for saying, well, the Democrats are just trying to gain favor from the poor in the middle class. And what we've seen so far is that's very unlikely to be true, because the poor in the middle class don't seem to have any influence on legislative outcomes. In all likelihood, really, what the Democrats were achieving was they're trying to meet the preferences of the economic elite and interest groups. And so that's largely what was happening. And so when we ask rich people about their attitudes about anti-poverty programs, rich people are much more likely to favor giving poor people health care than they are to give poor people money. And also pharmaceutical groups, health insurance companies, doctors, hospitals all wanted more paying patients. And so for the Democrats, when they were crafting what was considered our healthcare bill, the Affordable Care Act, what they were really trying to do was cobble together economic elite sentiments with favorable outcomes for our healthcare interest groups to then push through legislation that increased access to healthcare by providing more health insurance. And so it wasn't a handout to the poor. Instead, it was trying to meet the needs and preferences of our economic elite and our healthcare oriented industries. Very close call there. Okay. And so what the media, though, proposes, so if you read the media about the Affordable Care Act, what you almost always see is general public opinion and whether public opinion favors or opposes the Affordable Care Act. And I would argue to you that reporting by the media is immaterial. It doesn't matter, because the best data we have is that public opinion doesn't align very well with legislative outcomes. And so public opinion polling doesn't tell us very much about whether a piece of legislation is likely to be passed or not likely to be passed. What we really need to know about is what are the preferences of the economic elites and how are the interest groups aligning up on a piece of legislation. If we know those two critical factors in the United States, we're a long way towards understanding whether the bill is going to be successful or whether it's going to fail. All right, so this has been a very deep lecture. I hope you get something out of it that's useful for you. I provided here some additional reading references for you. These references are all in the public domain with full text. And so this article by Richard Posner in 1974 basically lays out the competing theories, but talks a lot about the theories of economic regulation, regulatory capture, economic theory of government. It's a great primary source. There are newer ones, but this is kind of like the seminal paper on it. I've also provided you this article by Martin Gilens, which describes the voting preferences and patterns in the United States two-party political system, economic elite domination, biased pluralism. All of that came from here. It's a great article. He also has a book that's very interesting if you want to get something like that. And then I'm also providing you an article that my wife and I wrote about local political advocacy. This was on the state level in legislation that we were able to get passed. And it tells you a little bit more about the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts about how do you go from an idea for a piece of legislation to seeing that legislation enacted. And so if you follow this link, you can find the full text there. Great. I've enjoyed talking with you today. Sorry I didn't get to meet you in person. If you have any questions, reach out to me through your instructors. Otherwise, I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.